Welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Faithful Despite Unfaithfulness. And it's for the fall quarter, lesson number 4, September the 22nd, 2019. And the verses it's taken from is Numbers, the 13th chapter, verses 1 through 2, and then 17 through 18, and then 25 through 28, and then going up to the 14th chapter, 14, 1 through 2, and 14, 5 through 10. Little background information. Let's put today's story in its historical context. Now, we're going to, as I'm discussing this, assume that the Exodus occurred at around 1446 BC. Now, there's a little bit of discussion and debate under which Egyptian dynasty the Exodus occurred at. But let's just, for this discussion's sake, say it is 1446 BC, and when the Exodus occurred, so the plagues and the Red Sea deliverance would have happened between January and April of 1446 BC. And then if you'll remember back the story of the golden calf, how the children of Israel had committed idolatry about that golden calf, that would have happened around 1446 BC in July. And then tabernacle construction, that would have taken place somewhere around April 1445 BC. And if you'll remember back to Miriam's, where she was slurring her brother and trying to usurp authority over her brother, and then she was stricken with leprosy. That would have happened around June 1445 BC. And then the story for today about the spies going out into the land of Canaan would have happened the latter part of the year in 1445 BC. Now, I do realize as I was discussing that, I was using the names of our months as I was discussing that, because I was only talking very approximate, and it's just so confusing to be a Gentile and try to think of the months in the Hebrew calendar. So I went ahead and used our months as I was discussing that. But the important thing that I want to point out is that the Exodus story, we are only somewhere around a year and a half, maybe 2 years, into the Exodus story when this comes up about the spies and how the spies were being sent. And also, too, I want to, just as a background comment, point out the number of times that the children of Israel had already went into a little bit of rebellion by complaining and whining and going on prior to the spies being sent out. Okay, Exodus, the 13th chapter, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." Now, a couple of things we want to point out here. First off, that these tribes had, as best as I can understand, they generally had 2 leaders. So this is only one of those leaders was going to be sent out to spy out the land, and that no tribe was going to be exempt from sending a leader. That way that when they come back, it would have been easy for each of the tribes to understand and agree with their leader, because they had somebody that they trusted would have been part of the expedition. So that's one of the reasons why it was spread out to all 12 tribes. And there were 12 spies who were being sent. Now I want to point something out that Brother John Gill said, who knew significantly more about Hebrew than my meager understanding of the language. But according to Brother John Gill, he said that when the Bible says send some of these men, it is more of a permission than a command. And the idea here, and this is being supported by other people's interpretations of the story, is that the children of Israel had wanted to have someone go out and investigate. They wanted to do some research about this land that they were about ready to go into. And they were right on the very edge of the promised land. They were on the very edge of the promised land. And this was only a year and a half, 2 years into the Exodus. If they had just moved, if they had just had faith, all they had to do is take the land. And it was there. They were right there on the edge. But they wanted to do a little bit of research and think about it a little bit. So God gave them permission to send these spies. Jumping down to the 17th verse, Numbers 13, 17, and 18, when Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, "Go up through the Negev and on to the hill country, see what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many." Now this Negev was the lower southern region of the promised land, and it was basically desert. It was sandy and hot and not a lot of vegetation. And they were to go through the southern part and go pretty much all the way up to the end position of where the promised land was to end. And they were to investigate and see what kind of fruit and everything that was available in the promised land, and to check out what the strengths were with the people who were there. Now, continuing on, Numbers 13, 25 through 28, at the end of 40 days they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them, to the whole assembly, and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." Now, stop and think about this report that they bring back. What they're saying is that this land is very fruitful, and it would be great for us to live there, but these people who are there are strong. They have fortresses, and they even have descendants of Anak there. Now, without going into a lot of detail, because there's a lot of discussion in Bible theologians and Bible scholars about the significance of the people of Anak. And there are different theories, and some people believe that the Anakins, the people of Anak, were they were like the Nephilim, who were before the flood, who were the children of God, the sons of God, and the daughters of men had intermingled, and they were strong and men of renown before the flood. And some people believe that they were a mixture, that particular people were a mixture of angels and human beings. There's other people who do not believe that. And there is a lot of legitimate discussion that goes into the history of Anakims, the sons of Anak, and the Nephilim, and that kind of thing. But there is one thing, and I won't waste a lot of time during this lesson going into my strained viewpoints on this, because I don't have a definite opinion about how that all works out. There is one thing, though, I do have a very definite opinion about, and that is in the Promised Land. There was a race of people who lived in the Promised Land who were extremely large people. We know that Goliath and his brothers were extremely large. They were terrifying. They were so large. They were just way heads and shoulders above everybody else. And undoubtedly, they were kin to these same people. So we do know that they were giants who lived in the Promised Land. And back before you had gunpowder and you had guns and bullets, if you were going to go out in warfare with a mallet or a club, and the person that you're fighting outweighs you by 150 pounds, and none of it fat, and they big and huge, you got a huge problem on your hands. And that's what these spies had pointed out, and that was what they were coming back saying, is that we saw some huge warriors. They were giants. They were head and shoulders above us. And that's what they were saying. And let me tell you something. When you let the fear of things overtake you, you can be paralyzed with fear. And this is a lesson that Joshua, who was one of these spies who went on this expedition and brought back a good report and was a man of courage. We note that in the book of Joshua several times it says, be strong and courageous, because he knew how paralyzing fear could be. Now, the writer of Proverbs 29 and 25 says, fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. And the history of these particular people that got this report and got afraid, their life story would have been completely different if they really understood that verse in Proverbs. Of course, that Proverbs had been written by then, but if they knew the wisdom that is in that verse, Proverbs 29 and 25. Now, the gospel has instances of people being overcome with fear. John 12:42 and 43 says, "Yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. For they loved human praise more than praise from God." Now, friends, we need to not be afraid of man. We need to put our trust in God and be courageous and strong in the Lord. Now, Numbers 14:1 and 2. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness." Well, come to find out, when it's all said and done, they're going to be dying in that wilderness because they're not going to get to go into the promised land because they had been afraid. They had listened to the evil report, the bad report from the cowardly spies that were sent in there. And we have to be careful about taking advice from the wrong people, from getting involved with the wrong people. 1 Corinthians 15:33 and 34 says, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning, for there are some who are ignorant of God. I say this to your shame." And that idea that Paul was telling the Corinthians is that if you run with the wrong crowd, you'll pick up their wrong thoughts, you'll pick up their wrong habits, you'll pick up their wrong methods, and it will corrupt you. So bad company corrupts good character. And that's what happened to the children of Israel, as these spies had been giving them a bad report. And they were sucked into the deception and to the cowardice of those bad spies. Now, jumping down to the 5th verse, Numbers 14:5 through 10. "Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, 'The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because He will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them.' But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites." So we see here how that the two courageous spies, Joshua and Caleb, how that they had come back and stood up, and it troubled them deeply to hear all of the garbage that the Israelites were saying, and the fearfulness and the cowardice, and how they had turned on the people who had worked with the Lord and obeyed the Lord and brought them out of Egypt. And how they had They were telling them the encouraging things about how good the land was. And the whole assembly was talking about stoning them. And then God showed up. The glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. A couple concluding thoughts. Like I had mentioned before, the wish that they had, wish we had died in the wilderness. The people who had whined and went on like that actually ended up dying in that wilderness. Let me tell you something from personal experience. Set a guard on your tongue. Do not give yourself into rash talk, because there are times that if you run your mouth and give rash talk, God can show you that you should have kept your mouth shut. You know, I'm not going to go into any details, but I actually can say that from personal experience, that if you sit there and run your mouth and say something rash like, I wish I was dead or something like that, God can show you that things can change at the twinkling of an eye. Things can change, and it won't be the way it won't be the way you was hoping it was going to happen. And that's what happened with these people. They said, well, we wish we just died in the wilderness. Well, they sat there and wandered around in that barren wilderness for 38 years after they said that. It was 38 years that they sat there and suffered and went around just right at the door of the promised land without going in, because they had run their mouth and with all that stupid, silly, rash talk they gave. Something else, too, that I want to point out to you is about Brother Caleb. You know, they had mentioned the people of Anakim, the children of Anakim that were there, and how they were so afraid of them. Did you know that when Caleb was given his land that God had promised him, and he had been rewarded because of the good report that he had given and the courage he had showed at this moment, that the people he defeated when he got his land was the children of the same people that they were talking about that they were so afraid of. God will give us victory over the enemy. We've got to be strong, courageous, keep our eyes on the prize, because in pressing on to the mark of the high calling. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.